Hello viewers, welcome to Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2010 Toyota Camry with a 3.5 liter. The complaint on this vehicle is that the lights on the dashboard come on intermittently while the vehicle is being driven down the road. The customer said every once in a while all the lights on the dashboard will come on and then they will start flickering, and then a few minutes later they will just go off by themselves. And she said when the temperature is really cold outside, she has to jump start the vehicle. So this is a telltale sign of a defective or weak alternator. I tried to duplicate the customer's complaint. I was trying to confirm it outside, but I couldn't. I mean, it was pretty warm out today, and once I got inside the vehicle, I started it, it starts back up. There's no lights on the dashboard. So, which definitely tells me that this issue is intermittent. It happens sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. There's no check engine light. Everything seems to be running fine right now. So, this is caused by a defective alternator or a defective battery or something wrong in the charging system or a bad wire. So, but usually this is caused if you have lights that if all the lights on the dashboard come on while you're driving, if all the lights just all of a sudden come on, this is usually caused by a defective alternator. So since there's no check engine light, there's nothing right now to give us directions. So what we're going to do is we're going to test the charging system. We're going to grab a multimeter and test our battery. We have to make sure that the battery is good. If the battery is good, then we will test the charging system. So I'm going to bring you guys over here under the hood so we can start by testing the battery. So now let's test the battery first, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do next. Alright, so we are here under the hood. We're going to use our multimeter to test the battery. So we're going to set our multimeter on the voltage scale. So our red lead is going to go to battery positive. And then the black lead is going to go to battery negative. So as you can see, we are reading 12 volts. So it's kind of fluctuating between 11 and 12 volts. So right there, I just saw 11.9, but right now, yes, so it's going between 11.9 and 12 volts. So this battery is slightly undercharged because a well-charged battery should read 12.6. Okay, so 12.6 volt is a charged battery. A charged battery should have a voltage of 12 volts, 0.6. So this is slightly undercharged, but this is not going to prevent us from doing our test. So now what we need to do is 12 volt is good enough. 12 volts should be able to start this vehicle. With 12 volts, we should be able to start the engine. We're going to start the engine, and with the engine running, the alternator should be able, the alternator, which is somewhere over here, the alternator should be able to charge the battery. With the engine running, we should have a voltage of 13.5, so it should be between 13.5 and 14.5 volts with the engine running. Because when the engine is running, the alternator should be charging the battery. So the voltage we need to see has to be between 13.5 and 14.5 volt. After that, we're going to load the circuit. We're going to load the charging circuit by turning on all the accessories. So we're going to turn on the headlights, the radio inside the vehicle, the blower motor. We're going to set it up to full speed. With the charging system loaded, our voltage shouldn't drop below 13 volt. Okay, so with the charging system loaded, the alternator should maintain the voltage of the battery between 13 volt and 14 and a half. So now what we need to do is we're gonna go inside the vehicle and start the car. After we start the car, we're gonna come back here so we can watch the voltage on the mirror to see what kind of voltage we're gonna read while the engine is running. So let's go inside the vehicle and start it. Alright, so I'm inside the car. I'm gonna start it. So as you can see, the vehicle is running. There are no lights on the dash, besides the tire pressure monitor light. The vehicle starts, it runs. So now let's go under the hood and look at our mirror to see what kind of voltage we have at the battery with the engine running. So let's go back under the hood. So we are back here under the hood. As you could hear, the engine is running and we are reading 13.6 or 13.7, so it's kind of fluctuating between 13.6 and 13.7 volts. So we have 13.7 volts at the battery. So the alternator is somehow charging the battery. I don't really like what I'm seeing right now because there's no load right now. Nothing is turned on. The headlights are off, the radio is off, the blower motor is off. With the accessories being off, the voltage at the battery should be at least 14 volts. I mean, 13.5 is pretty good, but ideally I like to see 14 volts at the battery with the loads off, because once we load the charging circuit, the voltage is gonna drop down. So 14.5 is what I wanted to see, but we have 13.6, which is not really bad. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and load the charging circuit. So what we wanna see with the charging circuit loaded is nothing below 13 volts. If our voltage drops down below 13 volts, then we have a problem. Ideally, with the accessories being on, our voltage should be at 13.5 or 13 volts. So I'm gonna go inside the vehicle, turn on the headlights and turn on the radio and the blower motor to see what kind of voltage we're gonna have at the battery with the accessories on. So I'll go inside the vehicle and turn the accessories on. Alright guys, so we are back here under the hood. The vehicle is running. I turned on the accessories, I turned on the headlights, the blower motor is on up to full speed, the radio is on. So now let's see what kind of voltage we have at the battery. And as you can see, we have 12.3 volts. So this voltage is too low. Something is wrong. So the alternator is most likely not charging the battery. I say most likely because you see our voltage is still dropping. I think I saw 12.2 volts. Yeah, so see it's going between 12.2 and 12.3. This is abnormal. With a good charging system, while the engine is running with no accessories on, you should have a voltage between 14 and 14 and a half. So basically 13 and a half and 14 and a half with no accessories. And when you turn the accessories on, your voltage should be between 13 volts and 13 and a half. Ideally 14, but 13 is good. 13 volt or 13 and a half is good. But as you can see, we are around 12.2. So this is abnormal. This is caused by a weak alternator or high resistance in the charging system. I say this can be caused by a bad alternator because, I mean, 80% of the time when you are experiencing this, the issue ends up being the alternator itself. Or you can have high resistance on the positive side of the charging system. So if there is high resistance between the battery and the alternator will not be able to charge the battery. Or if there is high resistance between the negative side of the battery and the alternator will not be able to charge the battery either. So what you need to do is you have to test your charging circuit first before you replace the alternator. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a voltage drop test. We have to make sure that there's no high resistance on the positive side of the alternator and there's no high resistance on the negative side of the alternator. So now what we need to do is we have to get access to the alternator. We have to remove this cover, this plastic cover here, because the alternator sits around this area. We're gonna remove this cover so we can get access to the alternator. Once we get access to the alternator, we're gonna do a voltage drop test on the positive side of the alternator. So we're gonna connect our test lead between the positive side of the battery and the B positive terminal of the alternator. So basically we're gonna go from positive here on the battery to the positive on the alternator. And our voltage drop should not be above 300 millivolts on the positive side. And then we're gonna do the same thing on the negative side, okay? So, and after doing the voltage drop test, then we're gonna test the control wires on the alternator. So I'm gonna remove this cover. This cover is held on in place by these little plastic screws. So I'm gonna remove all these plastic screws and then I'll take this cover off. Once I take this cover off, I'll bring you guys back up so we can do our voltage drop test at the alternator. So I'll get this removed and then I'll bring you guys back up. Alright, so I removed the plastic cover that was covering the radiator and the alternator also. So here is the alternator. And this cable here you see is the B positive cable of the alternator. Okay, so this here is the B positive stud of the alternator. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my negative test lead of the multimeter to the B positive of the alternator. So we're just going to connect this over here. So right there. So basically we have the black lead on the B positive of the alternator and then the red lead on the positive terminal of the battery. So positive to positive. Okay, so now I'm gonna start the vehicle. I'm gonna start the engine because we have to do this test with the circuit loaded. So we're gonna start it, and with the engine running, our voltage here on the multimeter should not be over 300 millivolts. If we have a voltage over 300 millivolts, it means there's high resistance on the positive side of the charging system. So now I'm gonna go start the vehicle and then we will watch the multimeter. As you can hear, the engine is running and our black lead of the multimeter is connected to the B positive terminal of the alternator, and then the red lead is connected to the B positive terminal of the battery. So as you can see right now with the engine running, so we're connected positive to positive, okay? So positive on the battery and positive on the alternator. So as you can see on the mirror, we are reading 90 millivolts. So this is good. We don't have voltage drop on the positive side of the alternator. So now we're gonna do our voltage drop test on the negative side. So what we need to do is we have to move our red lead to the negative terminal of the battery. As you can see, we're reading 12 volts now because the negative lead here is connected to the B positive terminal, and we have a minus sign because the test leads are backwards. So, and this is no big deal. So our red lead now is gonna go to battery negative, and then our black lead here, we're gonna move our black lead to the alternator case because the alternator is grounded on the block. So what we need to do, I'm just gonna connect it right over here. I hope you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just gonna connect it. I'm just gonna put it right over here on this bolt. So here is my test lead. So I got my test lead right there on the alternator bolt. Okay, so that's gonna be grounded to the block. So basically we're going from negative to negative, and as you can see we're reading 0.0. So there's no voltage drop on the negative side of the alternator. So as you can see, we're going from negative to negative. So negative on the battery and negative on the alternator, which is the alternator case. And we're clamping our alligator clip on the alternator bolt. So there's no voltage drop on the alternator, so the charging system is good. There's no voltage drop on the negative side, and there's no voltage drop on the positive side. So now what we need to do, we have to check the control wires of the alternator. So this connector you see had 3 wires. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna turn off the engine, we're gonna disconnect this electrical connector, and then we're gonna back probe those 3 wires and we're gonna scope them. I will bring up the lab scope so we can back probe those 3 wires and see what kind of command we're gonna see on those wires. I am going to grab my lab scope so that we can set it up and test the control wires of the alternator. So I will turn off the engine so we can test those wires. Alright, so I'm gonna remove this engine cover. Let's get this engine cover out of the way. And then I'm gonna remove this test lead over here. Let's just put it right there. So here is our alternator. Now what we need to do is we have to get access to this electrical connector. So I'm gonna disconnect it. There's a little tab back here that you have to push and then pull. So there are our wires. So there are 3 wires on that connector. So there it is. Okay, so alright, so we're gonna back probe these 3 wires. There are 3 wires on this electrical connector. I will get these wires back probed and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can test these control wires. So I'll get this back probed and then I'll bring you guys back up. We are down to the last step before we replace this alternator. I got those wires back probed, so now let's look at the lab scope. We're gonna set up the lab scope first and then I'll go inside the vehicle and start it. So let's go to scope multimeter. And since that electrical connector's got 3 wires, we're gonna turn on 3 channels here on the lab scope. So let's turn on channel 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so we're gonna be on the voltage scale. So we are on the 20 volts scale, so that's good. And our time base here is 50 milliseconds. I hope you can see, so that's good. And just right off the bat, I see that the second channel, the green trace, is showing battery voltage. So right there, when we look at the digital numbers here, so we have 12.33 volts. So this tells me that one of the wires on this electrical connector is got battery voltage with the key on. So that's good. Now, I'm gonna start the engine. Alright guys, so we're back here under the hood. We are still back probing those 3 wires on the electrical connector of the alternator. And look at what we got on the screen. So both channels are reading 12 volts right now. Remember before, with the key on, engine off, we had 12 volts on the green trace, but the yellow trace and the blue trace were at 0. So now with the engine running, they're both showing battery voltage or system voltage. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn on the accessories, because right now the headlights are off. So I'm gonna turn on the headlights and we'll see if this control here is gonna change on these traces on the lab scope screen. So I'll go turn on the headlights and the radio and the blower motor and to see if this is gonna change. So I'll go do that and then I'll bring you guys back up. So I turned the accessories on, the headlights are on. Okay, so this here tells me that the charging system is good. Like I said, I feel comfortable at this point with what I'm looking at. I feel comfortable replacing this alternator. So we're gonna go ahead and replace this alternator. I feel comfortable replacing it with what I'm seeing right now on the control wires of the alternator. We have battery voltage with the key on, engine off. Only one channel has 12 volts. The rest of them have 0 volts, and once you start it, there's basically 12 volts on all of them, but there's some type of activity here, some type of ripple effect on channel 1 and channel 2. So I feel comfortable with what I'm looking at. The issue is just the alternator. So I'm gonna turn off the engine so we can get this alternator replaced. Alright, so I turned off the engine. So right here on the lab scope screen, only channel B, or the second channel, so the green trace, is reading system voltage, but channel 1 and channel 3 are down to 0. So now what we need to do is we're gonna disconnect these test leads here. So we're gonna get them out of the way. Okay, so let's get these out of the way. So we're gonna get these out of the way and remove this alternator. Alright, so now we're gonna remove the alternator. The alternator has 2 bolts. There's one over here, one up here. So this bolt over here, that bolt, So we're gonna remove this bolt, and then there's another bolt below it. So underneath the alternator there's one long bolt. So once we undo that bolt and this one over here, and then we're gonna undo this B positive terminal cable of the alternator, and then we're gonna disconnect this electrical connector. Once we undo this, and then before we remove both bolts of the alternator, we're gonna take the tension off the serpentine belt. So the serpentine belt is hidden somewhere over there. So we're gonna have to get access to the serpentine belt through the wheel well. So I'm gonna remove this tire, and then we will get access to the serpentine belt through the wheel well. So we're gonna take the tension off the belt so we can remove the alternator. But it looks like this this fan, the cooling fan, has to come out also. So if it comes out from the top, I'm gonna have to remove the cooling fan, and I have to remove this support also. So this support has two bolts. So this is what supports the radiator. This is what holds the radiator in place. So if I remove these bolts, so 1, 2, and then there's another set up here. So these two bolts, so 1, 2, and then these ones here for the latch, and then this support will come out. So once I remove this, I can push the radiator back so I can get the alternator out. So I'm now gonna film replacing this alternator. Replacing the alternator is really straightforward. So I'm gonna get this alternator replaced, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can verify our repair. And after we verify our repair, we will deliver this vehicle to the customer. So I'll bring you guys back up once I get this alternator changed. Alright guys, we are back here under the hood. We're gonna verify our repair before we wrap up this video. So I did replace the alternator. This is the old one, and the new one is being installed. So right there is the new alternator, nice and shiny. So I'm still back probing the control wires on the alternator electrical connector. So now I'm gonna start the vehicle so we can look at our control on the lab scope and see if the control will be any different from what we just saw. And then we're gonna use our multimeter to monitor the voltage on the battery as the engine is running. So with the engine running, with the accessories off, we should have at least 14 or 14.5 volts at the battery. And with the accessories on, our voltage shouldn't drop below 13 volts. So I'm going to set up our lab scope here first. So let's go to scope multimeter. And our lab scope should already be set up from last time. So right there. So the lab scope is set up. I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and start the engine. Alright guys, so the engine is running and our new alternator is right there. So we're gonna test the charging system. So right now what I have noticed is that we have 3 flat lines on all the channels. So all our channels are reading system voltage. Remember before we had a couple drops across the screen, but right now we don't have these drops. So this tells me that the drops that we saw were being caused by the defective alternator. So since this is new, since this is a new alternator, so these flat lines that we're seeing across the screen should be a non-good pattern. In this 2010 Toyota Camry, if you back probe the 3 wires on the electrical connector of the alternator, with the engine running, you should see system voltage on the 3 wires. And right now, the voltage we have at the battery is 14 volts. So right here we are reading 14.06. So 14 volts is good, okay? Ideally I would like to see 14.5, but 14 volts is good. So now I'm gonna turn the accessories on. I'm gonna load the charging system, and with the charging system loaded, our voltage shouldn't drop below 13 volts. So we don't want our voltage to drop below 13 volts with the charging system loaded. So remember before, with the old alternator, we were reading around 13 volts while the engine was running with no accessories on. And when we turned the accessories on, our voltage dropped down to 12 volts. I think it was like 12.5 or 12.6. with the accessories on. So right now we are reading 14 volts and our accessories are off. So no headlights on, no blower motor on, no radio on. So I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and turn on the headlights, and we're gonna see how low this voltage is gonna go. It shouldn't go below 13 volts. So I'll go inside the vehicle and turn on the headlights. So I got the accessories on. As you can see, the headlights are on. I also turned on the radio. I turned on the blower motor to the highest speed. So right now the voltage we have at the battery is 13.82 volts, which is good because the rule of thumb is with the accessories being on and the engine running, the voltage should not be below 13 volts. So ideally you have to be between 13 and 13 and a half or 14 volts. And as you can see, we are definitely within the normal operating voltage. So this is good. The issue was a defective alternator. The alternator wasn't charging the battery. Remember before, with the old alternator, when we loaded the charging system, we turned on all the accessories, the voltage dropped down to 12.6 volts. So, which told me that the alternator was not doing its job, which is charging the battery. So this is awesome. And let's look at the lab scope. We have 3 flat lines. Remember, on the other capture we saw, there were drops here across the screen. We don't see those drops anymore. So those drops were caused by the defective alternator. And as you can see right now, with the engine running and the accessories on, we are definitely above 13.5 volts. So this is good. The issue was a defective alternator. So I'm gonna turn off the engine so we can wrap up this video. Alright guys, so I'm gonna leave this right over here. This vehicle is fixed. This vehicle was brought to us because the lights on the dash will come on intermittently while the vehicle was being driven. So when the customer told me that, I knew that we have a problem in the charging system. So the first thing we did, we checked the battery. The battery had 12 volts. We started the vehicle. With the vehicle running with no loads on, we had 13.7 volt. And then when we loaded the charging circuit, so we turned on the headlights and the blower motor and the radio inside the vehicle, our voltage dropped down to 12.6 volt, which is a sign of a defective alternator, because with the engine running and the accessories on, the alternator should be able to charge the battery to keep it up to its charge, because if the voltage is low enough, the battery is not going to get charged, and then when you stop the vehicle, it's going to be hard for you to start it back up. The battery will be discharged. So the alternator wasn't charging the battery. And with the engine running, with the accessories and everything on, we had 12.6 volts. So that's really a telltale sign of a defective alternator. The rule of thumb is with the engine running and the accessories on, you should have a voltage between 13 volts and 14 volts. So between 13 and 14 volts with the accessories on. If your voltage starts to drop below 13 volts with the accessories on and the engine running, it means you have a problem and you have to check your charging system. So we did that. We did a voltage drop test on the positive and the negative side of the alternator. We checked the control wires on the alternator. So we had voltage on the control wires of the alternator, and then I went ahead and replaced the alternator. I had to remove the radiator so I could get access to the alternator. I didn't film the whole process because it was really tough, and I mean there isn't enough room, so I wish I could have shown you what I did, but you know, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to do, but the only thing is it's so tight. As you can see, the engine bay is really compact, so there isn't enough room to work with. That's why I didn't film it, but you know, I took the tension off the serpentine belt, disconnected the you know, the radiator hoses, the fan electrical connectors, and then I removed the radiator, and then the alternator was right there. I replaced it. I brought you guys back up once I got everything back together. We tested it. And as you can see right now, with the new alternator, with the engine running and no accessories on, we are reading 14 volts. And then when I turn the accessories on, the headlights, the radio, the blower motor, with the engine running, we were reading 13.80, I believe, 13.80 volts, which is good because, again, the rule of thumb is with the engine running and the accessories on, your voltage shouldn't be below 13. So you have to be between 13 volts and 14 volts. So if your voltage is at 13.5 or 13.4, that's good. So I'm going to leave it over here. This is fixed. I'm going to test drive this and then I'll call the customer so she can come and pick it up. I will leave it right over here, guys. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you like this video. If you do like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. Once again, thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.